Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and we're back to our normal, everyday programming. This is Monday. I hope you're having a great Monday. Everybody loves the Mondays, but you should, because that's now Highly Respected's favorite day to podcast and record. So that's what else could it be happening on Monday? Just look forward to the Highly Respected at 5 p.m. Eastern Time every Monday. So that's what you got to look forward to this day. And this week I did something different. Over the weekend, I decided to give the power to the people to choose the main topic for today's discussion. I gave three great, terrific subjects for people to pick. I had as the options DeSantis and the future of the GOP. I had Civil War delusions, and then I had this class war meme. And, it was a very close battle between, even with all the three. I mean, none of them got more than 50%, and it was very close between Civil War delusions and DeSantis and the future of the GOP. But DeSantis and the future of the GOP narrowly defeated Civil War delusions, so we're going to talk about that today. The other two topics we'll talk about in the near future, probably within this month. So if you really wanted me to talk about that, you will probably hear me talk about that in the next few weeks. So I'm going to talk about, of course, mostly DeSantis and the future of the GOP. I've got a few other topics near the end. We've got a lot of great cognitive elite questions today as well. So not the only thing I'm going to discuss today, but most of what I'm going to discuss today. So last week, Ron DeSantis, if you guys don't know, if you've been living under a rock, he's governor of Florida. People think he's going to be the next Trump or even much better than Trump. He defined himself as the leader as the main opponent against Biden's push to institute more lockdowns, more mask mandates, and, impose a fear and panic on America in the wake of the Delta variant strain, or whatever they wanted to call it now. So he gave he first gave a speech where he was supposed to make his mark. He was supposed to say, I'm the guy, I'm the main champion against Biden. I'm the leader of the GOP now, standing up against mask mandates and vaccine passports and against Biden's failed administration. I gave the speech, and Republicans and conservatives loved the speech. And, I think by its content, by what was written on paper, is very good. He mainly attacked Biden for keeping the border open while trying to shut down the travel and really the lives of ordinary Americans, but he's doing nothing about the border. And he's saying the real COVID spreader is coming from the border, and he's allowing the whole world to come here to spread disease and get American citizens sick. That's definitely a message we want. And then he went on and said how he's going to impose masks on kids and harm their education and shut down their schools. I think if you look at everything he was saying within that speech, what was written down, it was very good. But the impression from conservatives on seeing this, it's not a very long speech. It's like 4 minutes long. And you can watch it on Twitter or YouTube. And conservatives are like, this is the greatest speech I've ever heard. This is, wow, Biden just took him to the shed. Like, whoa, he demolished Biden. And then you watch the speech, and there's a problems. I think that this is really illustrating some of the problems with DeSantis, is that when he's reading the speech, it is definitely somebody acting, and it's not as charismatic and as forceful as you would think with conservatives. Like, all the people quote tweeting it out are just like, this is just savage. And then he's like, Biden is keeping the border open, and he keeps looking down at his paper, and it's like he's there, and it's a little awkward, and he's trying to imitate Trump mannerisms, especially with his hands, like he's with the one finger up and just the moving across the podium. There's a lot of Trump mannerisms he's trying to emulate. But he doesn't have the Trump charisma and the Trump energy and the Trump sense of humor. And then he ends with I don't want to hear a blip from you. And then people are whoa, and there's two guys in the back who are just wow, he really said that. And it is really contrived. Now, I don't want to criticize the content. I mean, this is one of the things about DeSantis is you don't really want to criticize the content, but there are showing errors and shortcomings with DeSantis with that. And then you really got to see this with his response to Biden. They asked Biden, reporters asked Biden about DeSantis' response, and Biden said, Governor who? And he began laughing. And then he went into it, and like all the reporters were laughing. And just with that statement, it showed that like Biden, even when he's like partially senile, and he may have not even known who I mean, I think he did know who DeSantis is. I mean, despite his mental state, he showed like his ability to be funny and humorous and charismatic, even at he's turning 79 this year. DeSantis doesn't have that natural sense of humor, that natural banter. He has to really prepare himself, and it has to be an act. And this was really shown in his response to Biden, because a reporter asked him about this, and he had clearly written out notes about what to say. And, in case, a reporter asked him about Biden. And his response, he kept looking down at his paper. He's like, I'm the governor who gets things done. I'm the governor who's protecting you. And I have to ask. And it's like, and people are like, he savages Biden. And I think by the content he was delivering, it's good. But it's not actually, this is not real and authentic. He has to keep looking down at a piece of paper, and his eyes keep going down and up, and it's not as persuasive or as animated as you would think compared to other politicians. Like Biden, even in his advanced mental state, if they asked him a question he had prepared, and they had really prepared him for it, he doesn't have to look down at his paper. He will give like a good response to it. And you saw this all the time in the debate. When they really, really prepped Biden, and they probably maybe loaded him up on Adderall or whatever they were giving him to get him up on his energy level, he was very good at delivering these responses. DeSantis he didn't deliver it, in a convincing way. It's like he is like trying to do this act as a Trump, as a respectable Trump, but he always has to keep looking down at his paper. And so this is, I'm beginning this off with, it's a good way to discussing this, because I think a lot of people don't want to acknowledge these faults with DeSantis. They don't want to acknowledge any faults with DeSantis, unlike with Trump. But I think his, these two big speeches or, statements he gave that conservatives were story jacking over were not as good as they made them out to be. 2024 speculation, of course, is really early. This is 2021. I mean, I've been around in politics for a while, professionally for a long time. And I can even remember back in 2013 when people were going through the strong 2016 contenders, and they were pretty much talking about Rubio, Rand Paul, Rubio was, sort of competitive, but of course Rand Paul didn't get anywhere. And even if you looked even at the time of 2015 or early 2015, 2014, and who they thought were going to be serious candidates, many of them didn't turn out well. Look at Scott Walker. Scott Walker was, I think, only in the race for like a month or two before he had to drop out, and he was completely terrible on the national stage, and people predicted him as like a front runner. And that, of course, never happened. But that was all due to the Trump factor. I don't think in 2024 there is going to be a Trump figure who just comes out of the blue and then captures the entire base. It's going to be a known quantity. There's very few, even if you look back at American history, there's very few Trump-like examples that can really captivate. And there's not really this like celebrity waiting on the wings who is very charismatic, who knows how to connect with the Republican base. There's not really that figure. That figure still is Trump. And there's still this, eternal loyalty to him. I don't know if eternal may be too hard of a word, but there's still this strong loyalty to Trump that there isn't for any other candidate. You can see this in every poll. If they ask Republican voters who they prefer for 2024, it's over 50% in every poll prefer Trump, even when they include DeSantis. DeSantis is usually around 9 or 10% most of these polls. And even when they went to CPAC, the CPAC in Texas, last month or so, they asked people there, do you prefer Trump or DeSantis? And these are the activists who are the most, this is the activist core. And you have to remember is that CPAC in 2016 was anti-Trump territory. Like Trump didn't even go there because it was run by never-Trumpers, and they were all favoring Rubio and Cruz at that time. Now, when they take a poll, when they include Trump and DeSantis in it, 70% prefer Trump and only 20% prefer DeSantis. Now, when they take Trump out of the field, DeSantis is the preferred choice. I think it was over 50%, and then he blows everyone else out of the water. Like Mike Pence isn't even competing. Kristi Noem, all these other people are not even. I think Pence had double digits. I think nobody else really had double digits. They prefer DeSantis over. If Trump's not in the field, DeSantis is the front runner. But with Trump in the field, like there's not even a competition. Like, he's just the nominee. But as I've said constantly, this is not the first time I've said it on the podcast. Trump, it may not be able to run. There is a way that if you're, censored, you're not allowed on social media. If you're getting debanked, Stripe did remove the campaign from its services after January 6th. And this could all continue. I mean, you could see bank accounts refusing the Trump campaign account. There was a bank that canceled actually Trump's accounts, after January 6th as well. And all these things continue to pile up. I mean, as I've outlined in past podcasts, talking about the scenario, but we could see this where Trump tries to run and every TV network says we're not going to run for your ads, and then YouTube says the same thing as well, and everyone says Facebook, of course, then nobody's going to run his ads, and then TV networks are not going to give him airtime because that's a threat to our democracy. And Twitter and YouTube are censoring clips of his speeches. And YouTube has already done this where they've taken down speeches made by Trump, and they've censored all clips of it because, it violates the rules because he says things that threaten our democracy or spread disinformation. And this could very well accelerate over, if he tries to run for president. Now, this is a factor that is so overlooked whenever these conversations happen, especially among ordinary conservatives and normal conservatives and mainstream conservatives, is that they do not take into effect the reason why they're even discussing another person is because Trump can't run because the system said he can't run. And then there's like, oh, well, we'll shrug our shoulders. We'll go back to normal eventually. And then it's like there's something very abnormal, something very completely different and antithetical to our system, that the fact that our previous president can't run because corporations told him he can't. He can't use their services. And there's all this overlooking, and it's like, okay, everything will be back to normal. It's like, no. And then Trump is still going to be hanging over this primary. And I have to say, from the point of perspective right now, all indications say that Trump is going to run again. The only reason that he might not run is that if he realizes that it's going to cost him whatever, all his entire fortune, it's going to lead to possibly criminal prosecutions, or he just can't run. I mean, there is the factor is what happens when he can't run. And the solution is we'll just run an ordinary Republican who sort of sounds like him, who runs on some of his same issues, and then it will be all back to being normal. And the thing is, so let's take the broader picture here. Republicans will win if they want to run somebody, but the system says no, and then they're like, okay, we'll go with DeSantis, and the system's like, okay, we'll allow him to be on our tech platforms, we'll allow his advertising to run, but anyone like Trump, we're just not going to allow. And now that's the new normal. That's the new standard, is that they can veto whoever you have as a nominee. I don't think they would, and even though people always say it's DeSantis is going to be much more of a threat than Trump, and I think the establishment's going to realize that. It's no way on earth that they're ever going to see him as much of a threat as Trump. That's not necessarily criticism, but that is looking at the facts honestly and with clear eyes, is that they're not going to use that censorship against them. And the system does realize that it can't just shut down every Republican. It has to allow the pretense that this is a two-party system and that people have a choice in democracy. We may start losing that choice, of course, and I mean everything is now, and I've also said this previously, is all our laws and the way we're governed is now completely determined by the judiciary and the executive branch, much of which we don't have. I mean, the only time we have control over the executive branch is every 4 years and picking the president. Outside of that, there's not much control we can have, especially if that president is beloved by the media, as we're seeing with Biden. He can do whatever the hell he wants. It doesn't matter what the Constitution says. And, the legislative branch just kind of sits there and doesn't pass anything. So now we're all coming down to this. So there is like a question is like, is this really a democracy? That's like a separate topic, but that's something to keep in mind for this discussion. So they do need that pretense, and by shutting them down, that will eliminate that pretense. And they would set the guardrails for what they're allowed. Now, people who would also run that they would be willing to shut down because they now have that standard. They now have the precedent. I mean, they launched an effective coup against the president of the United States. They effectively silenced him and took away all his power while he was still in office. And this is coordinated by both corporations and the deep state and the military and various parts of the federal government. They all came together and agreed that like Trump may be president, but we're no longer taking orders from him, and we're effectively shutting him down. It's the new standard that they can use against any Republican or anybody they perceive as a threat. And they can use this against presidential candidates as well. I mean, big tech no longer respects the fact that if you're a political candidate, that you're allowed to use, their platforms. And DeSantis did pass some bill that, said that if you're a political candidate in Florida, then, you can't get kicked off a platform. But of course, it was thrown out by the courts, and it appears that DeSantis has forgotten about it since then. Everyone likes to say he gets stuff done, but is that really getting stuff done? Before I continue on with our conversation, I do want to say one point about DeSantis is that there's always this meme that he gets stuff done. And you have to look at the things he's getting done. I think when you look at coronavirus and how he's handled that, he's done a very good job. They've been very strong against mask mandates. They've been, he was one of the first states to open up. They've been very resistant towards having lockdowns again. He's been fighting against schools in various liberal cities in his state to, make sure that they're not going full libtarded. He's been very good on that, but if you look at outside of those issues, I mean, some of it isn't that really great. I mean, everyone went over the moon about his tech bill, but the tech bill had no teeth. And sources have told me that they were, when they were informed about this stuff about the free speech, and they're like, this isn't going to really protect free speech. And they were like, well, we do not want to protect anti-Semitic speech on the internet. We don't want that. We're worried that may lead, that these, implementing this type of language will lead to that. And so they're pro big tech censoring anti-Semitism on the internet and anti-Israel criticism. And that's showing that, this is not very serious about free speech on the internet. And then this bill came out, lacked any teeth. It was, just entirely going to support powerful people who may worry that their political campaign may get kicked off Twitter or whatever. And it was overthrown by the courts, and they've shown no follow-up since then. He's done E-Verify in the state. That's good. But I also think it's when it comes to this topic of immigration, his hands are going to be tied, because if you're coming from the state of Florida, your power base has to be the Cuban community. And the Cuban community is very hesitant about legal immigration restrictions because they think it's going to affect them. And that's always going to become a problem when DeSantis, if he wants to do anything about legal immigration or refugees, he's going to have to deal with the Cuban community having a much more powerful say over those matters. And the Cubans will be like, well, this may limit us, so we're not in favor of that. And so that's something that you always have to keep in mind if you're coming from that state, is that you're dependent on the Cuban power base. And a lot of ordinary Cubans would, of course, support legal immigration restriction and, hardly any refugees. But the leaders in their community are very pro-immigration and pro-refugee resettlement. And, those are the people that are going to have DeSantis' ear. So that's something else to keep in mind about his record. But going back to the subject of, their ability of the system and the empire ability to censor and shut down candidates, is that there are some people who may run in 2024 who would have that similar effect. I think the thing could happen to Tucker. Tucker, he could be, if he gets the nomination, if he becomes, looks like he's going to win, I think they could use any pretext for them saying that. They could just say, he could go off on something and talk about the great replacement, and then them saying, every tech company says, we will not tolerate racism. So he's then kicked off by Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And, TV networks stop taking his ads because they're like, we no longer tolerate hate speech. And he's effectively deplatformed, say, a month before the election. and he can no longer run. It's like they've said that he still has his free speech. He can talk on the street corner, and then he can have, and then they see people canceling his campaign events and saying they're not going to have it, and like, well, he can. He's still running for president. This is democracy. He still has free speech. He can still talk in his own home, and like that's what's gonna. I could see a similar thing happen with Tucker. And the other insurgent candidate I could potentially see with this, I actually talked about this in a Twitter space with Nightmare Vision and Current American Citizen a few weeks ago, is people are going to laugh about this as the future 2024 candidate to watch, but I could also see this happen to Candace Owens for probably the same reason as Tucker Carlson, and people may be rolling their eyes and say, Candace Owens, oh man, this would be the biggest grifter operation, Con Inc., we're just going to hate this. And a lot of that is true. I mean, Candace Owens isn't exactly the always held to her beliefs. She was a liberal leftist of just a few years ago, and now she's the biggest conservative star. I'm aware of all of that, but as she ran her campaign, it is guaranteed to probably be more right wing and like dealing more with our issues than probably even like Tucker and Trump, because she has an ability to know what the boomers want and delivers it to them in a way that no other white conservative commentator could, because that white conservative commentator would worry about getting called racist. And she just delivers it forthrightly with total energy, and she really does connect with that audience. Now, whether she's going to run or not, I don't know if she's going to run. I don't think she is. I think it would be one of the candidates, if you're thinking about token conservatives who may run in 2024, I think if Larry Elder becomes governor of California, which is a likely scenario considering how the recall's going, it may be, all that energy probably go to Larry Elder. And if he, that could be the one candidate that people haven't been discussing that could turn out to be the 2024 frontrunner. That situation I'd have to go over if he actually wins the recall. If he doesn't win the recall, if Newsom stays in power, then that's all a moot point. And that's something to consider. But if Candace Owens ran, it would be, she would run on a campaign agenda that if any white person ran, like they would immediately have the censorship happen to them. But due to the fact that she's black, she would just like be saying stuff. I mean, like it would all be about race and identity matters. It would be entirely race baiting, all culture war stuff. It would be very entertaining. It would be very good content too, because I mean, she does have like the power to just like, yeah, I mean, everyone's like talking about owning the libs. She is actually very good at that. Republicans would always invite her to committees when they would talk about reparations or hate crimes or terrorism, white nationalist terrorism, and they would invite Candace Owens there, and she would just sit there and destroy like these like SPLC and ADL staffers to the next to her and call them racist and stuff, and they would have no response, and they're just like these dorky people with glasses, and they're like, oh, I object to that, and she's like, you know what you're not talking about? The Democrats founded the Ku Klux Klan, and she would just go on these whole like rants and like in the middle of the congressional hearings, and it would create a circus out of that. And she does have that power to connect, and I don't know whether she's going to run or not. I think it's probably about the same likelihood as Tucker, maybe a little bit less. I don't really know the scenario with that. And I think if you've seen like people who are running, the other people are going to be running in the field. She may just like decide to back somebody else rather than run herself. But that would also be another person they would probably censor, is that eventually they'd realize like she has like she may be calling for violence or something. It's like because there's like less rules and less guardrails of like worrying, and she may go off on some epic rant, and then like all of big tech says, no more platform for you. And so this is now how our democracies operate, is that there's a veto power over who Republicans can nominate and run as a president. And, does that really mean that we can just like solve everything through the presidential election? And I think that shows that there's like deeper problems here. And it's, there's systemic wide issues that cannot be resolved just by a presidential election, because there are powers that the president even has to answer to. It's like thinking of it. It's like Greek mythology. Like the gods are eventually have to answer to fate, and that's a higher power than them. And now in our society, presidents have to answer to big tech and the media. They have the final veto power, and it's this power that they really can't control. Is that there's all these other institutions that have the final say over the president, over what he can do, and we saw this time and time again with Trump. Is that he went and he wants he has executive power, and he's like, I want to use the military against rioters. The military said no, he can't do that. And he's like, and he also wanted to challenge the election. He wanted the DOJ to investigate. DOJ said no. He wanted to speak on Twitter, and then Twitter said no. And they kept censoring his posts throughout 2020. And they had already set the precedent, not president, for censoring him in the year before in 2020, and they eventually just went forward with it after January 6th. So they've already crossed, it's a metaphor to say cross the Rubicon, but we're going to use it anyway. They've already crossed that, they've already crossed it, and they can use this again and again and again. And if you're really thinking that DeSantis is going to be a threat to the system, you have to answer for the fact that why won't big tech censor him? Why would they feel more comfortable with him? Now, this is a theoretical. You could say, well, we don't know what could happen in 2024, but I think if they were censoring him or the other candidates or the normal Republicans, that does rip off the mask that we have we have a democracy, that we have a two-party system, that people actually have a choice. Instead, that is something I think that even Democrats would feel that that's too much. I would think the military, the deep state would just think that that is too radical of a position, because they do need to make people feel like they live in a democracy and a republic, and that they do have a choice when they go to the ballot box. And by taking DeSantis away or whatever Republican candidate they have, that does just end any pretense of that. And that is like, they don't want to do that. I mean, they may change their mind over the years, but I don't think they're ready for that. They're not ready for that point. And the media, of course, would support it, but I don't think they're not going to do that against DeSantis or the other candidates. And so this is like the future of the GOP. Now, I think, there's a couple of other things I want to discuss, but I think the one thing to discuss is how does DeSantis compare to Trump? And I've talked about this a little bit in the past, but I think it's good to do, a side-by-side comparison and where they stand. And I think the one thing I've been pointing out throughout the podcast is showing that, the system and the empire feels threatened by Trump. They do not feel the same way about DeSantis. And yes, there are hit pieces coming out in the media about this DeSantis that they're not for Trump, but they're not warning that DeSantis is a threat to democracy, our way of life, in the same way with Trump. And it's not, and that view is not also, that view about Trump is universally shared by all the people in power, by every single institution. Like generals say that, the people who run the CIA say that, the people who run the Justice Department say that, even justices that Trump appointed say that. And of course, the media says that, universities say that, everyone says that he's a threat. The one thing that the media outlets say about DeSantis is that, well, he may actually get some of these things done. And you're like, well, what are those things that he may get done? One of those things is banning boycott, divest, and sanction movement. That is a very important focus of the DeSantis' administration. He made it, he outlawed universities being able to participate in that and would deny them funds. Essentially, he went after campus anti-Semitism in his administration. People argue that Trump also did. There are similar problems. I want to say is one of the things about DeSantis is that all the criticism about Trump can also be made about DeSantis. Some things about him being too pro-Israel is DeSantis, I believe, signed that bill, the anti-BDS bill in Israel, or he signed one of his bills that was dealt with Israel or criticism or some of that sort. He did that in Israel. He also decided to, with all the problems we have in the world, he decided to launch a crusade against Ben & Jerry's for refusing to sell ice cream in occupied territories in Israel. And yeah, he has the same problem as Trump. People always want to say is that Trump was too pro-Israel. That same problem would exist with DeSantis. And, if you're talking about getting things done, it's easier to do things on a state level than it is on a federal level. And if you look at his tech idea was completely fruitless. And he, even if like my sources are correct, are people I've heard from, this bill, he has no concern for actually protecting what would be called hate speech on the internet. He wants that censored as well. And I don't even think that was a take given by Trump. And one of the things you have to realize about Trump is that in the last year of his administration, he did set a rule that would have empowered the FCC to review, tech platforms and whether they're actually living up to Section 230. Section 230 is, of course, the rule that grants the tech platforms publisher immunities, which on one of the partial basis that they act as neutral forums. Of course, we know that that's not occurring, and that may make them publishers. And some of these tech platforms have argued that they are in fact publishers in lawsuits against them. So he was going to empower the FCC to look into this matter and, possibly get them to support free speech. Of course, that didn't happen due to him getting ousted from office. But it did show if he had won a second term, this could have actually been empowered, and that something could have actually been done about tech censorship. But he's now out of power, and tech companies are being encouraged by Democrats to do more censorship. And DeSantis' bill wasn't really anything. E-Verify is important. Of course, whether he would do that on a national level is another matter. I don't think he's not talked at all about illegal immigration, which Trump at times did talk about legal immigration. It's a matter of controversy over whether Trump was serious about legal immigration, but he did endorse the RAISE Act in 2017, which was going to cut legal immigration by half. That's more than DeSantis. DeSantis may support something like that, but I am skeptical due to his strong support among the Cuban community, especially as that's one of his power bases. And he's not going to support more illegal immigration. I think he realizes the problems with that, but I don't think he's going to go for something like the RAISE Act or something that's going to seriously reduce immigration. And even if you look at Trump's immigration record from 2019 onwards, it was pretty good. He, through executive power and executive, actions, he was able to cut legal immigration. And when you look, he was also able to reduce refugee emissions to historic lows. I mean, Obama wanted refugee emissions to go over 100,000 per year, and Trump eventually got it down to 15,000 per year. He's making it harder for immigrants to obtain green cards. There's a public charge rule that said that immigrants that are likely to go on welfare or government assistance are not going to be granted green cards. That was an achievement. And they did put things that were designed to make it harder for illegal immigrants to come here, such as remain in Mexico, that barred entry to people saying, "Oh, I'm an asylum seeker." It's like, well, you're going to have to wait in Mexico, rather than the Biden administration policy, which is like, here you go, roam around America. You're now free to roam around America, and then forcing them to stay in Mexico deflated them and made many of them go back home. And there's many of other things that he tried to do with immigration. I think it's like a lot of it had to be done through legislatively, and I think he should have done something before 2019 on immigration. He should have done a lot more. But if you're looking from 2019 onward, through executive power and ignoring some of his statements, he was doing a pretty good job on immigration. And I don't think any president arguably since Calvin Coolidge has done more proactively and positively on the direction of immigration other than Trump. I mean, if you look at every other president, they've all increased immigration and gone and been lenient on illegal immigration. Trump was the first one to try to reduce immigration and to seriously diminish illegal immigration. But unfortunately, we have a system that kept overruling him and overruling many of his policies, such as cracking down on sanctuary cities. And now DeSantis could follow this playbook as well. I don't think there's anything to say. I would say DeSantis probably would do most of what Trump did. One thing I failed to mention is that Trump did impose an immigration moratorium during COVID. And when it was expanded and extended, I think it was in June of 2020, it was actually a serious proposal that actually did cut out, I believe it was estimated, over 500,000 immigrants that would have otherwise come here. So that is a serious achievement. And I don't want to doubt, and I don't want to, there's people always like to say he didn't do anything. He did do stuff. Of course, he could have done more, and it should have been doing much more in his first 2 years. We all know the criticism about him, but I don't, you do have to look and just say he didn't do nothing. And these are serious achievements, and they are much better than any president we've had in the post-war era. But I think, as I said, I think DeSantis would carry on most of these policies, especially if he's being advised by people from Heritage or the Center for Immigration Studies. I think he would follow most of Trump's executive policies, especially like the public charge rule and such. I think he would follow that. I don't think he would go after illegal immigration, which is always the point that people think that like DeSantis is going to be really tough on. Is he'll actually, endorse policies like the RAISE Act or really aggressively use the federal government to cut down illegal immigration. I don't think he would do more than Trump. That's the one thing I want to say is that maybe the one thing he could get done is mandatory E-Verify through the system, but, okay. But I want to look at the problems that I think that really comes down to with DeSantis versus Trump is on the two things that I worry most about DeSantis is the domestic war on terror and the effort against free speech. You would put that all in one category. And then the second is foreign policy. On domestic war on terror and the free speech or hate speech issue, the one thing that made Trump better on this is that Trump did understand that these are his supporters, and he didn't really like attacking people he felt that were supporting him. Now, a lot of times, yeah, of course he could have done more to show support for these people. We all know this about the criticism about Trump. But he is, he at least understood and he would not want to sign off on all these ideas because he's like, these people are my supporters. And in some ways, that's what he saw in Charlottesville. He saw a lot of Trump hats. He was like, why would I condemn my own supporters? And he did this time and time again. Even when like January 6th was occurring, he didn't really want to condemn them because he saw it as his own supporters until he was forced to. DeSantis would not show the same regard. If he was told by, the experts that white nationalist terrorism is the number one threat to our country, I think he would be more likely to agree with it. While Trump would have this feeling that I think they're going after my own supporters. Now, DeSantis may realize that after 4 years of, the Biden administration using this as a pretext to go after ordinary conservatives and Republicans and like his own voter base, that he may realize like, oh, the domestic war on terror is actually domestic war on the Republican voters. He may not support that, but I think he would be more inclined to agree with their pronouncements that we will not tolerate racism and hate speech in our society, which Trump would only say when he was at the point of a gun, when he was under pressure to say that. I think DeSantis would show much more support for that. And I think even if with any free speech effort that he undertook, it would come under this assumption that anti-Semitism would not be tolerated, and we actually do want to get rid of racism and hate speech off of social media. I think Trump also at the same time understood that this was going after supporters, and the people who would be more likely to advise Trump on this matter also understood that as well. DeSantis may carve out these exceptions, like we're fine with like Twitter getting rid of the supposed Nazis or whatever, and that he won't go along with it. I think is that DeSantis is much more loyal to the globalist American empire than Trump is, even though Trump was, of course, not the ideal opponent of the globalist American empire. He did at least understand that there's something inherently wrong with that, and he was a non-interventionist by instinct, which DeSantis is not. Now, everyone likes to say, I think that foreign policy never really comes up as much when it's discussing these 2024 hopefuls. And then people always point out like, well, DeSantis opposed the Syrian strike or opposed intervention in Syria in late 2013. Well, and the main reason he did that is because Republicans saw this as like an Obama move, that this was going to be supporting Obama's war, and it became a partisan fight. And when they looked at polling, most Republicans were showing that they did not support the idea of a war in Syria. When this happened in 2013, it was over one of these supposed chemical attacks that Bashar al-Assad launched against his own people. That's what they said in late 2013. But Obama eventually said, He didn't follow through with it. And there wasn't the political will for that. This was a popular issue that when people faced with the idea of war, they didn't like the idea of it, and DeSantis responded in popular movement. That was good, but I think that one of the things about DeSantis being considered more competent than Trump or being able to get things done is that if he actually wanted to get a war with Iran, I think he'd be much more able to get one than Trump. And this is really what they want. This is like the main effort. One of the things you need to remember is that the chief function of the people who determine Republican foreign policy is that the main objective is to depose the regime in Iran by any means necessary. And anyone who's going to be running for president is going to have to appeal to these people. And if DeSantis got in there, I think that due to his stature, the fact that there's not as much hate for him as Trump, or he's not as divisive, and his ability, probably in these generals and the deep state being more inclined to work with him, I think he could be more likely to get a war with Iran or anywhere else. And I think another thing is he'd be much harder on Russia than Trump. As Trump had like a natural sympathy, I mean, it wasn't like controlled by Russia, but he just had a natural affinity for Putin and Russia. And he just didn't, I mean, yeah, he would give more weapons to Ukraine and stuff. He's like harder on Russia, but it was like, the idea of war was never contemplated with Russia. I think that DeSantis does not share that same affinity with Russia that Trump has, and he would be much tougher on Russia, and that could get us into another conflict in that regard. And I mean, the main thing is I think he would just not be seen as somebody who's going to challenge the system, is that he would be reforming it to strengthen it, and that a Democrat could come in and carry on many of these same policies, but differences on how they're operating on immigration policy. And the chief difference between Trump and DeSantis is that DeSantis is a politician. He is embracing these ideas and principles because he sees them as popular, as in the moment, and it worked for Trump. And he feels that he can present a respectable Trump who is not as scary, not as terrifying, not as much as a challenge to the system, and that he could still win. And it's a smart bet to make. And I think if Trump doesn't end up running, and DeSantis' reputation stays firmly intact still into 2023, 2024, he'll be a strong contender in the race. I don't necessarily say guarantee, because there's so many things that can happen between now and then that we don't know. And maybe Tucker or Candace Owens gets in the race, and that does shake things up a bit. And you don't say, and like those are actually the two outsider candidates, or Larry Elder becomes governor of California, and that he could also be a strong contender. So there's like things that you don't want to say, but out of all the people who are being touted now, Mike Pence, Noam, Greg Abbott, a few other people, he stands as the strongest contender, and I see that staying true, barring any unforeseen changes till 2024. But if he ran for president, he would not be. One of the things that you want to say is that like supporting Trump over DeSantis, and people get very heated whenever I even suggest this. Like, people get so mad at my mentions that are like, he didn't do anything. I hate Trump. Why are you standing up for Trump? Trump is a betrayer. And they so all these people just like imagine that DeSantis is everything that Trump was not. The grass is greener on the other side with DeSantis. And they refuse to accept, and they get very mad if you make any criticism about DeSantis, because then they'll immediately go to Trump. But the main reason is to favor a Trump run over DeSantis is that it is perceived as a threat to the empire, as a threat to the system, as the ultimate threat to the system is this. And DeSantis will never be like that. Like, you can say, like, okay, they'll complain about him. I mean, of course they're going to complain about him. They're going to make up stupid attacks. But in terms of, like, the deep state and the military and all these people getting very, very worried about another Trump presidential run, that won't happen with DeSantis. It's not. That's just not. I mean, the media is, of course, going to say the same main things about DeSantis as they did with Trump. Probably not as hyperbolic, but, they're not going to like him either. With Trump, it is a much more meta-politically interesting and a much more of a threat to the way things are to the status quo than DeSantis. DeSantis is almost a return to normal. He is really National Review with Trump stylings. I mean, National Review also, there's not many different things that between National Review and DeSantis. The National Review has had some criticisms of DeSantis, but you have to think is that why does National Review love DeSantis? Why does people like Brad Palumbo love DeSantis? Why does Eric Erickson love DeSantis? But they all hate Trump. And you have to ask is it because he's more of a threat to the system? Is it because he's actually going to really tear down the establishment? No, they just think that he's a safer choice, that he's not going to go off the deep end, that he's not going to really challenge things in the way that Trump will. And even though if Trump, yes, we all know his many failures in the office, like personnel and all that things, this is another criticism that DeSantis and Trump share is that I think if you look at the personnel, people expect like DeSantis is going to go to the based and red pill department and just hire everyone from that. No, he's going to go to Heritage Foundation and AEI to staff his administration, just like any other standard Republican. I think if Trump got a second term, he would have a much better personnel to pick from, mainly because they eventually figured out hey, there's all these base people who actually want to work in the administration. And there are, people who could actually put good people in there rather than when he was picking his administration, he's charged with Chris Christie and random, and Mike Pence and Reince Priebus to field a staff his administration. And of course, that didn't work. And then eventually they got better people in there in 2020. That was his last year in office. With DeSantis, I think it would be, people I don't know who they're expecting him to appoint, but it would probably even be more heavy on Con Inc. and Republican establishment than Trump. I mean, those people love Trump. I mean, they love DeSantis. They have to pretend they love Trump. They don't love Trump. They all hate Trump. And those people they're the ones sending out tweets I'm tired of Trump. Trump is a loser. There's no reason to support him. DeSantis is the real man to go, or the real person to support. And, you're just a little hesitant. It's all these people were saying the same thing in 2016 about Trump, but now they're trying to say is Trump is weak and the real threat is DeSantis. I don't really think that. And I think it's that DeSantis is really just return to normal. I mean, he's good as a governor of Florida, but in terms of being the leader of the party, he really can't even compare with Trump and his speaking ability. As you look at these two speeches he gave last week that all these conservatives are swordjacking over, they're very contrived. They're not very powerful. He's looking down at a piece of paper. He's even he's trying to remember his words. He's not as confident in his own words that he's saying. He's saying the right things. It's not authentic in the way that Trump is. Trump would give just an hour-long speech, and it would be funny, and it would just be him going on these riffs, and the people would love it. That same energy cannot be had for DeSantis. There's not this, intense loyalty and devotion that Trump has that can be shown for DeSantis. And that's something that people need to keep in mind. And that's another reason to think is you want Trump. Is Trump, you want that movement back. Yeah, and you want that and it's going to be a different energy this time because he's now, he's banned, he's punished Trump, and he's coming out for revenge. And that creates, a different spirit and attitude. And it does create meta-political opportunities that I think people need to keep in mind that in a way that it won't be for DeSantis. And I think, if Trump doesn't run because he can't run, I think, people need to understand that, we're not going to solve things through a presidential election. There are deep systemic rot that's going to take a long time to fight and combat. And hoping one presidential election solves this is silly. And we're going to see much growing radicalization on the part of the powers that be between now and November 2024. And so I would say it's DeSantis. And if you're thinking about who would, of course, DeSantis probably is the next best choice if Trump doesn't run and if Tucker and Candace Owens don't run. I would actually, that's the controversial point, is I actually will say that Candace Owens would probably be much funnier than DeSantis. I think it would show as a clown show, as America would be exposed if like we have Candace Owens as president. There's a degree of invalidation of the system, is that the system is like undermined by having loses a lot of its respect and reverence if you have somebody who's like Candace Owens as president. Now, yeah, you have to be like, oh, that's so silly and ridiculous, but we don't necessarily have. We do want to make these things silly and ridiculous. We do want a little bit of chaos, to so to speak, in these presidential elections, and whoever promises to do that, it was more worthy of our support versus like, oh, well, let's look at their record. Let's look at what their record says. Like, I vote on record and policies, not on their statements or stuff. And it's like most people don't follow along that line. So I think, that's the real thing to keep in mind with DeSantis. But I mean, if it's just like standard Republican politicians running, yeah, there's not going to be anyone better than DeSantis. But it's not going to be really great if otherwise. It's not really a threat to the status quo. It's not really a threat to the establishment. In a lot of ways, the globalist American empire will be strengthened, and it would probably gain the loyalty of those middle Americans that are losing their respect and loyalty for it if they see it as a hostile power. But now DeSantis can make them love it again, and by making a few changes here and there. But I mean, there's not going to be serious systemic changes under DeSantis or really any other president, but it's about making the system weaker and discrediting it more than it is about completely changing or reforming it. And so that's one thing I want to keep in mind. And going over, people love the speculation of 2024 presidential candidates, but I do want to first preface it with this. Like, we're not likely going to vote our way out of this. I mean, this is like, some people are like, oh, radical solutions. And no. This is simply just saying like there's going to be a long effort about like changing the hearts and minds of Americans, about winning them over and really changing how they view themselves and this country and how they view life itself. That has to change and transform before we get to where we want. And I don't want to be like, well, elections completely don't matter and voting doesn't matter. That's not even really true, because a lot of our culture and a lot of how people view themselves and their country and these social and cultural attitudes are shaped by politics and elections. And having somebody out there who's talking about our issues and pushing people in a better direction in a lot of ways that Trump did, that is important. And due to the fact that we don't have much cultural power whatsoever, one of the few ways that we can interact with the public is through the political process. And so they still matter, and there's still like importance, I think, in like a state and local matters. I mean, if you're going to choose a Republican or a Democrat, it's likely better for a Republican. You're probably going to have lower taxes, and your gun rights are going to be better respected. So even on those respects, even on quality life issues, like you should want a Republican over a Democrat, but that's not really what is most important to us. I mean, this is a civilizational struggle we're in, and this is going to be a long process, a long fight, and it's not going to be resolved by one election. And, if you're thinking that DeSantis is going to be the great Caudillo, the great savior, I think you're pretty delusional. I don't think there's any scenario showing that. And if you're really getting inspired by him looking down to a paper and saying inauthentic lines and trying to be Trump, I do question that. I think people are just saying this because they're just tired of Trump and they're wanting to move on to DeSantis. And this is primarily driven by the conservative intelligentsia and conservative media rather than the Republican voter base. The Republican voter base still loves Trump more than anyone else. So on the basis of seeing the election as a way to push people in our direction about waking up the identities of the historic American nation and making them question things and see things in a different light, and also just shaking up the system and challenging it, the best person to go with is Trump. This is Return of the King. This is the guy that they banned, that they punished, and now he's running again with the full support of middle America behind him, and they're going to try to stop him. And there does rip off the mask of democracy and the facade that we see ourselves as this like noble and virtuous country that we're not going to allow our former president to run because he said mean things on Twitter. And it does show the absurdity of this country, and it does drive the conversation in our direction, as I want to emphasize, much more so than DeSantis. DeSantis is too much of a return to normality, which we don't want. And but there is something positive to say about DeSantis, and this does speak to the future of the GOP, is that the future of the GOP is nationalist. It is adopting a lot of Trumpist rhetoric, especially on immigration and on how the people of America are seen as we're not returning to libertarianism. We're not returning to the conservatarianism of the early 2010s, not even to the Tea Party stuff of like imagining that the real things that animate the Republican base is some obscure tax code. No, it's about preserving the nation. And the GOP is moving slowly in this direction, but it doesn't have the effective leaders that it needs. And it is like a problem with I think this is a serious problem within American democracy historically as well, is that most of our politicians are responding to the whims of the masses. They're not necessarily as principled or as ideological as you imagine. Politicians change their views all the time because they're doing that to adopt to the masses. And this has been an effect ever since the beginning of American democracy. So it's hard to see. So that makes politicians not the ideal leaders you want, because these people are primarily interested in staying in power and vote and ensuring that they say or do whatever it takes to achieve that objective. And so they're not necessarily these people who are like noble and honest, who are able to, they have firm principles that they're going to lead an ideological movement to change the country, when they're not really as interested in changing the country. They're mostly interested in keeping their job. And so that's why, even if you look at figures who have really done the most to change this country, weren't necessarily politicians. Look at Martin Luther King, not a politician. And so even if you look at the abolitionists, most of them were not elected politicians. And so you have this we're expecting this level of ideological and principle cohesion from a politician that's just never going to be delivered. At the same time, there are still politicians who can push this in the direction we want. And the reason why we mainly need to still see Trump as the leader, even though, he doesn't make the right endorsements. Yeah, he made serious errors. Yes, errors. I don't know what the hell. I think I said errors. And no, it's errors as president. And yes, he had mistakes. And we all know all the problems with Trump. But he is still the leader who's pushing the GOP in the right direction, much more so than any other leader. And he does have a connection with the base that nobody else has. And he is seen as the greatest threat to the liberal establishment, much more so than any other politician. And that's something that you can't take away or discount. And so that's why you have, ultimately, if it comes down to 2024, I do find the possibilities of Tucker or Candace Owens presidential candidacy very interesting. And lots of content to come from it. So I think that the Candace Owens presidential campaign would possibly be the best content. But there are serious problems with Candace Owens outside of content concerns. I do think those would be interesting, but ultimately the person is like Trump. I mean, Trump is going to run again. I think there's going to be questions of just what does that look like, and if it's even possible for him to run again. And if it's if you're celebrating over the fact he can't run again, and now we can get somebody really serious, somebody that's really going to terrify the system, and Ron DeSantis, I think you're missing the big picture by a mile. You're trying to finding a silver lining and thinking that's the real takeaway, when it's really not. This is the bigger picture is that the empire can say who can run for president, and will choose who will represent red team, and they'll not let them pick Trump. And that's something I don't think the response to that is saying, yes, now we can have a real choice. I think it's just saying we're not living in a democracy. We live in an empire. We don't really have freedom, or our votes really don't matter. So what's the point? I think that's a much better response than thinking that, wow, now we get a much better candidate. No, that's not the response to have. So with all this in mind, no, I still think that the GOP is still, even yes, I just said that like elections might not matter, but the GOP is still going to exist. Elections are still going to matter to a certain extent, not to the extent of like just this one election is going to save us and everything is now different due to this election, but they do matter. I mean, imagine if Trump is still president right now. Just think about that. So those things do matter, and those things do count. But it's ultimately not going to be our ultimate salvation. Is that there is greater work that needs to be done in order to push our people into the right direction, and it's not just going to be done through elections. But elections still matter to a certain extent, but if it comes down to 2024, where it's like, Trump is like in the middle of the primary and stuff, and they just like completely shut him down, and we now get DeSantis, and I don't know. I don't know what the correct response. I think would just stay home, in that regard, or to boycott or vote for Trump. That would be the only response, because that would say that we're not going to accept the false choices you're giving us, and it would undermine DeSantis's whole campaign. That like the system says he's fine, he's okay, and that just undermines the whole point that like he's actually going to tear down the system. He's obviously not. That's why they're allowing him on Facebook. So that we'll have to see how that scenario plays out in the 2024 election. And yes, it's a long ways away, but it will determine how the future of the GOP is. And the GOP does understand that they can't return to the business first priorities of the past, that they can't openly support amnesty, that they can't, they actually have to respond to the interests of their own people. And if you look at all the things that they're running on right now, it's all about critical race theory. Even though they should be talking about immigration more, none of them are supporting amnesty. Some of them are supporting these small amnesties like a DACA amnesty, and then there's the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which grants legalization to millions of illegal farm workers and makes them indentured servants. There are a number of Republicans who are supporting that, but they are the minority. They're the small minority. And they can't get support for these bills in the Senate. And the Senate, even with all the wishy-washy senators that they have, like Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Mitt Romney, Ben Sass, those people aren't even supporting the big amnesty that the major comprehensive immigration reform bill that Biden wants. So this is a positive direction that Republicans are going in. We didn't have this in 2013. And in 2013, none of these people would have been talking about critical race theory. And this is now what they're running on. They're in 2022. They're running on essentially on our issues, even though there's still these idiots who still talk about socialism and Cuba and all these things that don't matter in Iran. They know that their voters most respond to open borders and critical race theory, and that's what they're going to primarily run on. And that is a positive development for the party. And the future of the GOP is going to be something that is much more nationalist than before. And I think that's why people who are wanting to return back to the business first, neocon stuff, total neocon, open, unadulterated neocon stuff like Nikki Haley or, Ben Sass or any of these other potential candidates in 2024 are just not going to succeed because people don't want that. I mean, Nikki Haley could never make a resounding response about CRT. And they definitely, and also the Republican voters care about freedom, like in a way that's actually like freedom. Your freedom not to be forced to take a vaccine to just go to the supermarket, or to wear a mask, and the freedom to not have to be arrested for not wearing a mask outside. Those are the things that people actually care about. And so the party is moving in a positive direction. Largely, some of this is due to Trump, and a lot of it is just due to grassroots efforts about what the people care about. I mean, parents are out there, protesting critical race theory at school board meetings throughout the country and demanding answers about that. And this is like a positive movement. Like some of the talk I gave may have been blackpilling for some, but I do have to say is that if you look at the grassroots level, if you look at the conservative base, if you look at what politicians they're liking, even with DeSantis's popularity, there is like a good part about that, because that is showing that Republican vote. This is a guy who realizes that nationalism is what sells, and like being opposed to critical race theory, to vax totalitarian, or the lockdown totalitarianism, and to immigration. That is what matters to the Republican base, not not talking about taxes or regulations or what the co-opted Tea Party talked about in 2011. They're talking about the real issues that matter to the American people and matter to the future of this country. So there is a positive development with that, but I'm largely seeing the positivity coming from the ordinary Americans and what they're going out and protesting and what really animates them more than the politicians who are responding to them. And whoever, takes up that energy, and this energy is going to be used in 2024, and I don't see it as us returning to normal as before. Even if DeSantis is the candidate, he's still going to have to build off this energy. But depending on what happens with Trump, it may not matter. So that is the concluding remarks I have about that subject. There's a few other things I want to discuss, but this has gone over an hour, and I have to get to the cognitive elite questions. So some of the topics, it was just one little thing I wanted to talk about, but I can talk about that at a later time, or maybe even save it up for an IQ supplement. So we will wait for that. But now it's on to the cognitive elite questions. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me or guest questions or suggest guests or topics for Highly Respected if you sign up for the cognitive elite option at Highly Respected Substack. And that's highlyrespected.substack.com. And you should subscribe anyway to the Substack so you can listen to the IQ supplements, which are put up once a week. And we're going to have another great IQ supplement for you guys this week. So now on to the questions. We got two pairs of questions from two different Cognitive Elite members. The first two questions come from Jack. He asks, here's the first question. 1, with BAP getting banned, why are all these integralists celebrating? Like that guy, Good Tweet Man, who got completely embarrassed for his tweets about getting stood up on a date. What exactly started this conflict? This is something, now for those who don't know, is Bronze Age Pervert, who he's supposed to be a guest on the show sometime. He's very fickle about where he goes on, but he'll probably be on the show soon enough. He's an interesting person. Some people doesn't necessarily need to say you endorse him, but he had a lot of good. I was liking a lot of his recent tweets lately. I was retweeting, especially him talking about marriage and the family and whether this is actually a political solution. I was really liking the stuff he was saying. And he got banned recently. It was for a ban evasion, actually. People actually forgot about it. It's actually remarkable how big he got. He got over 70,000 followers, and he was banned under his old handle, which was Bronze Age Pervert. Then he came back as Bronze Age Manus, and that's how he got over 70,000 followers. And I guess somebody finally figured that out, and they got him banned. Unfortunately, he'll probably come back. It's not going to affect him. He still has thousands of subscribers for his Gumroad podcast, and he's building up a Telegram presence. It's the same with like Nick. Nick is banned. Nick Fuentes is banned from Twitter, but he still has over 40,000 Telegram followers. He's still big on Gab. He's still got like 10,000 people watching his show every night, at least. And his show is like deplatformed for most. It's like he's having to run the show on his own platform. And he's still able to retain his audience. So with people who get so big, they're not going to be silenced. And it's the same with BAP. It's the same with Fuentes. Now, when it comes to the people celebrating it, we don't really have necessarily a good term. I guess the best term is integralist. And I guess when we use this term, it's not. There are some people who listen to the show who may see themselves as integralists, but they get the issues around race and identity and nationality, and thus they're. And it's the same with a lot of Catholic trads who listen to this. This is not applying to everyone. I would say that integralist is the good term for the people who are non-dissident right trads. That's the best way to say that. It's like if you're in there's plenty of trads and integralists on the dissident right, but they get like a lot of the issues that we discuss on this show and other people discuss, and they're fans of Fuentes and BAP, and so those aren't necessarily the people I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the people within the dissident right when we're using this term. We're talking about the people outside of the dissident right, and it's people like Adrian Vermeule, Sohrab Amari, the mainstream voices like that, and then all these big accounts on Catholic Twitter. And all these people were very hyped up about BAP getting banned because they are obsessed with the terror, with the greatest threat to our country right now is paganism. It's the number one threat to Catholicism, and they are very upset about paganism. This is like such a silly thing. It's like all these integralists overlook other religions that are actually, have much more power than pagans and are much more of a threat to the Catholic Church. And and they're overlooking even the people within their own church who are undermining it, and all their efforts are just focused on like pagans and like Lutherans. And they do this because there's no political repercussions for caring about pagans. Like nobody's going to get fired for a job for being anti-pagan or anti-Lutheran. So they're just obsessed. And so they saw Pap as this like prime pagan who's like leading us to a dark post-Christian future, and we have to do everything to stop him. And a lot of these people are mentally ill, and they like to feel that they turn to traditional religion in order to feel better about themselves because they're losers, and they're hoping that by turning to this religion, they're gaining superiority over people that they hate. And it's the same with this guy, like Good Tweet Man. Like this, I don't know why we're talking about him. He's like a very sad account, and people really like him. And it's like there is like a pathetic nature to the guy. I mean, he's always complaining about how he can't go on dates, and like girls aren't texting him back. And it's just like, man, why are you sharing this on the internet? And I owned him with this like point where he had this whole like thread about how this girl stood him up on a date and never told him about it, never texted him about it. And then you're just like, bro, why are you texting this? And then he got mad at me. He's like saying, when you wait for judgment, you're going to have to answer for these tweets. And it's like, are you really saying like I'm going to have to stand in judgment because I owned you? Like, what do you like? But that's what they do. It's like they're very much about thinking that all the people that, that they hate are going to be in hellfire for all eternity. I mean, that is like a necessary part of traditional hell is an important part of Christian theology, but some of these people really turn to it in the idea that they have a gleeful joy in this fact that like somebody who owns them on Twitter is going to suffer eternal damnation for going after one of the poor suffering souls that are now an anti-racist traditionalist Catholic. And it's weird. So a lot of these people are like that. So they do, the main reason that they're celebrating is that they think that BAP is like some evil pagan, and paganism is the main threat to the church, and they can't wait to have an integralist state that can finally crush paganism because, it's a major threat to our society. And once they do that, we can finally have, the 1,000-year Our Lady of Guadalupe Empire. And we can finally enjoy multiracialism and multiculturalism all under one true church. But we're not going to discuss, but under this one church, we're also going to allow religious diversity for Muslims and Jews, because if we actually stated that they had to convert to Christianity, we would get censored. So they're that's like integralism in a nutshell. Is that, and once again, I'm using this to describe people outside the dissident right who are usually anti-racist traditionalist Catholics, not describing people within the traditionalists or within the dissident right who are traditionalist Catholics. Many of these people believe this, and so it is like silly, and there's like so much stupid pettiness on the right with everybody, like, people celebrating bands and stuff. And then like there's also the dumbest is like people who are Sean McCarthy, who is like a funny leftist who I've like said good things about, who is like saying that like he's no threat to the system. He's like a secret CIA agent because he's defended the CIA. And like McCarthy has had all these tweets defending CIA-backed groups such as the White Helmets in Syria, and backing CIA-backed supported color revolutions in Ukraine and Iran and elsewhere, are attempted color revolutions. And you're like, well, what's the real threat to the system? Is like BAP, who's like censored, and like the system, mainstream media pundits seem to complain about him a lot, versus you, who's talking about how the CIA killed Kurt Cobain, and that's really what they don't want us to talk about, while you're supporting every CIA-sponsored color revolution. You have to wonder what's like the real threat. So, people just have like the random pettiness that they like. There's like weird hang-ups. So with like Sean McCarthy, he didn't like that he supported that BAP was pro these military regimes in Latin America that, killed communists. And he doesn't like that, and that turns him into a CIA shill. And then the Integralists don't like BAP because they see him as a pagan. And, they really don't like this idea of like, guys working out for some reason. And so they're very much opposed to him for that. And that's why they celebrated him. And so it's like just due to the own eccentricities of these random online factions that they don't like. But Adrian Vermeule, who is like a real person, much more than like Good Tweet Man or all these other people complaining about BAP, he is very anti-BAP, and it is because he sees him as a racist and a pagan. And they want to. The thing is, like, some people may like the idea of integralism because it's authoritarian, but it's ultimately not that radically different from globalism. As like Vermeule has outlined his ideology as like it would impose gun control, it would have hate speech, it would imprison racists and dissidents, and we're not going to talk about what it would do with gays or anything that would actually cause us to lose our jobs or income or actually suffer any persecution from the system. But we're just going to say things that this system likes, that we're going to oppose. We're not going to have free speech, not going to have gun rights, not going to be able to allow to be race realist, and we're going to have open borders. And that's the integralist utopia to Adrian Vermeule, and he's just like, I'm not really supporting this. Just because not all authoritarianism is good. It's like if you like authoritarianism, then why don't you? It's like simping for like the EU and Joe Biden. I mean, both those entities are authoritarian. But authoritarianism in and of itself is not a virtue. It's not a good value. And if it's just there to support globalist values, it's not necessarily good. So. Yeah, so it's funny, but I think it's good that BAP is hated by a lot of these, that is hated by integralist dorks. If they actually liked him, I think that would be a cause for concern. But the fact that they dislike him exposes their phony selves for how they're just not really a threat to the system. They don't actually care about challenging the present order. They just want to, find their own little hobbit hole and just stay there. So. That's the answer to the first question. Now on to the second question that Jack has. He sent in two. He's like, Jack asks, how do you seal the deal on people who are almost with us on the issues but don't quite get it? He talks about somebody who thinks that big tech and financial institutions have too much power, but they say, they think that the free market's going to solve this issue. And he's also saying it's like another one is regarding anti-white racism. These people will acknowledge that it's becoming increasingly prevalent, but they think people who are anti-white will have their careers hurt, and suburban white libs and awfuls will realize that these politicians are anti-white and therefore not vote for them. So it's like, how do you convince these people to realize, that there's, to get rid of their stupidity? On the first one, I think it's actually working. Like, conservatives 2 or 3 years ago would constantly say, oh, the free market will solve this. Most conservatives now realize that the free market's going to solve this. Even people like Ben Shapiro admit that there's going to have to be some government solution, even though he may be hesitant about that. They no longer say just start your own Twitter. They are aware that that there is like this unfair built-in systemic problems that prevent another Twitter from developing, as it's like happened with Gab. Like Gab's, it's like Apple bans like Gab, and like all these services ban Gab from getting it on your phone. You have to use all these complex ways to get on Gab. Advertisers aren't going to support Gab. Gab gets debanked. It's like, these are things that other platforms don't have to worry about. But all the, the Twitter and Facebook don't have to worry about this. So they have an unfair market advantage against possible competitors. And I think most conservatives are realizing that. And yeah, I think there is, I don't know if we really have to fight on that one, because it's not really necessarily sealing the deal with that, because I think they're already there. When it comes to anti-white racism and it's going to actually hurt politicians, it actually does not. That can only be proven by just showing, like, okay, look, Biden had all these is surrounded with all these anti-white officials. Does that hurt him with those white suburbanites? No. And even with these white suburbanites, a lot of them are I think, certainly some of the liberal ones are going to be convinced that CRT isn't real. It's just like they're teaching diversity and equity inclusion, and they love diversity and equity inclusion. That's a much more difficult fight. You really just have to provide examples for them when it comes down, because it has become the talking point that schools aren't teaching critical race theory has gotten out into the mainstream, and these people are brainwashed to believe it's not a real thing. It's just a something from the right wing swamps. They can ignore it. You really just have to provide examples to them and just say, hey, here's what they're teaching in this school. Here's what they're teaching in this school. And it's best to find a nearby example. It's like this school is segregating kids by race, and they are explicitly teaching these kids that being white makes you feel bad, and that colorblind, if they're thinking that, oh, this is teaching everyone to treat each other equally, it's like actually they teach that white people carry a moral stain that no one else carries. You just have to provide actual examples for this. And I think if somebody's worried about those problems, they will eventually, wow, that's a pretty big deal. I don't want this in my school. And I think that's why there's this grassroots effort to stop critical race theory in schools. I think the only real argument that the other side has is to say, oh, it's not being taught, or we're just teaching kids to be anti-racist. What's wrong? Well, why don't you want to teach kids to be anti-racist? We're just teaching kids to be equal. And that's another thing you can see is like these schools are trying to hide this fact by making kids sign these agreements that they can't tell their parents, or teachers like, hey, we're having this lesson plan. Don't tell your parents about that. Those are a part, they want to hide this because parents really get angry about this. Even some only the worst white liberals are fine with like the stuff that they're being taught in schools. And I think a lot of ordinary people, like independents and Republicans, of course, are very much opposed to this. And that's why there's this grassroots movement against critical race theory. So I think events around us are making people move to our positions. It'll take time. It'll take patience. Some people will say a lot of stupid things. They'll make you say this stuff about race, but what about this exception? And what about this person? Eventually it's going to take time and effort. And I think the events happening in America and the way America is moving towards, more and more people are going to come to our side of the things just by, developments going on in the rest of the world. So I think that's probably the best way to seal a deal, is just wait for things to take their time. But I think if you're on that situation where you understand that anti-white racism in schools is bad, while you've moved on from the point of denying that that's what they're teaching, and you're now accepting it, and now you're saying, well, this is going to be pushed back against it. They're almost all the way there. There just needs a little bit more convincing. And I think those people will eventually get pushed in the right direction. The real problem is the people who will deny basic facts, saying that'll actually believe that there's systemic racism. Like the normies and the Reddit Americans are getting radicalized into being worse, while the people who are able to think for themselves, who have common sense, are opening their eyes to the truth and are just about ready to be all the way there. They just need a little bit more convincing and a little bit more events to show them the way. The real problem, though, is with these normies who they're watching ESPN and this other crap, and they're now believe that systemic racism is real and we need reparations. That's a bigger problem, and how to convince them or how to wake them up, I don't know if you can, but maybe there's hope. So those are my answers to Jack's questions, and now we're going to move on to Alex's questions. Alex actually has a question that I don't think he's going to like my answer, but he wants me to know, or he asked me if he wanted to know if I'm a Tool fan or not. And Alex does admit that Tool has a lot of Tools who like the band, and he's like, well, but what about their music? I would say this, the last time I got asked this question about Rage Against the Machine and System of a Down, I was very anti them. I would say that Tool is better than Rage Against the Machine and System of a Down. When you really listen to music, I don't find it that offensive. I'm not going to say it's really terrible, but it's definitely not my cup of tea. And yes, they're fans. Some music you can't enjoy without thinking of its outside context of whether the fans who are into it, the band itself, the main guy behind Tool, Maynard Keenan, is kind of a Tool himself, and you really can't ignore some of these factors. I don't find their music that bad. It's not really good metal. It's not really metal at all. I view them as like the flip side of what Dream Theater was doing. Like Dream Theater decided to, both of them wanted to emulate the prog rock of the 1970s. And Dream Theater did it from like a power metal perspective or a traditional metal perspective, like very melodic vocals, like soaring choruses and, you know, like in goofy keyboards. And that's what the music that they were going with. And I find Dream Theater too cheesy and too much, but I would say I would enjoy listening to Dream Theater more than Tool. While Tool came from an alternative rock perspective, you know, there's a very grungy aspect about Tool. And even the vocals, like, you know, it's very much what you would find on radio rock of the 90s and early 2000s with the whispering. And it's not like these melodic, traditional heavy metal vocals. You know, it's something that is more suited to, you know, not necessarily Pearl Jam or any of those bands, but and it is like a little bit more masculine than something like Smashing Pumpkins, but it is in the same vein of like the alternative rock. It's not necessarily trying to have these soaring, almost like over the top vocals that traditional heavy metal would have, or even like prog rock would have. You know, it's something that would be suited to alternative rock radio. But the music itself, it's not just really bad. It's just kind of like there. You know, it's like bouncing around. I can understand that like they're doing different song structures and they've got, you know, complicated rhythms. You know, it's not just a standard 4/4. But it's like that's not what I'm listening to music. I'm listening to music to, you know, evoke, you know, powerful emotions and like it's like actual powerful song structures and powerful melodies. Yeah, like power is an important part, or like inspiring things. And you know, it's not really. Yeah, I mean, it's ultimately not my cup of tea. And I also don't like the fact that, you know, it is like standard alternative rock that they decided to make like 10-minute songs out of and add like different rhythms and like some, you know, like, you know, they'll add like a acoustic part and like their whispering part. I really don't like the whispering. Like that is like a very weird aspect about alternative rock, is that they decided to have whispering. It's like, you know, I'm on this, and you're like, why are you fucking whispering? Like just like sing. Like, you know, I don't understand that. Like, and metal bands didn't have, you know, the whispering. You know, some of the death metal bands and black metal bands would like switch to less like a clean vocal, like spoken part. It wasn't whispering. I never understood the whispering. And then it's like going into the chorus where he's like shouting and so I would have to ultimately say, I'm trying not to be too mean, but like, no, I am not a Tool fan. I don't think it's, you know, it lacks a lot of the qualities of prog rock. You know, prog had, you know, really strong melodies. And, you know, it had song structures that really went somewhere. And there was like, you know, even just like the riffs and the keyboards that they did with it, you know, it's something that just like, wow, that's like really stunning. While this is like, it's just kind of like, you know, drab looking around. It's not really evoking anything. Like even the riffs are just kind of like a burn, you know, just like a standard like power chord that they're going with, you know, that they're trying to do in between like the like weird acoustic or just like so yeah, that's a concluding remarks. Not a Tool fan, but I would say their music is less offensive than System of a Down and Rage Against the Machine. So with that said, that is all we have for Highly Respected this week. We will of course cover those two topics I put to a Twitter follower poll over the weekend. We will cover those topics soon enough. And we're also going to have a great IQ supplement this week. It's actually going to be on the Woodstock 99 documentary, which it's going to be a great music discussion we're going to have. I hope so. It's good that we talked about Tool. I almost sort of kept it for that, but I don't think Tool played at Woodstock 99, and they're not like associated with it. But we'll have that. Be on the lookout for that, and make sure to subscribe to the Highly Respected Substack, and make sure to hit the like and subscribe button on Highly Respected's YouTube. And with that, until next time, stay respected.